Thank you very much, Isabelle. Thank you very much for this very interesting session. We will now turn to the second session, From Data to Action, leveraging the new fiscal database for research and policymaking. And I will hand over to Mr. Antimoiso.
Thank you, Margot, and welcome everyone to this session on the new fiscal databases, REGOFI and MUNIFI. In this session, we will discuss these databases from both research and policymaking perspectives, and we will explore how they can be used to formulate evidence-based policies and conduct in-depth research. Our discussions will cover some first results of composite indicators on degree of decentralization, the potential impacts of this data on understanding the fiscal capacities and financial health of municipalities and regions, as well as the usefulness of the data for analyzing public investment and unfunded mandates of municipalities. So in this session, we have first 3 presentations and then a comment speech. I will introduce each speaker briefly before their turn, and we have allocated 5 minutes for each speaker. Our first speaker is Agnese Sachi. Agnese is Associate Professor of Public Finance at the University of Urbino Carlo Bo since 2021. She was previously Assistant Professor in Public Finance at the Department of Economics and Law, Sapienza University of Rome, and since 2014 she has been a research member of Governance and Economics Research Network at University of Vigo. Her research interests deal with decentralization and local public finance, fiscal policy and taxation, and political economy. Agnes, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antti. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. Thanks once more for this unique opportunity to participate in this important launch of databases. I ask to go to the next slide, please. My 5 minutes will be focused on these 2 main topics, that is how the REGOFI and MUNIFI databases could be useful for application from a research perspective, say in academia perspective, and also try to playing with data. I have the pleasure to play in advance with the data and to provide some new fiscal decentralization indicators based on the 2 databases, say considering both together REGOFI and MUNIFI, and also the single one. Next slide, please. Considering the application from a research perspective, thanks to these 2 databases, granular data, we can provide new economic analysis based on the subnational level, and focusing on this kind of detailed budgetary data on the expenditure side, on the revenue side, in terms of aggregated and disaggregated level. And this is very important for all the OECD countries and also for many the countries belonging to the European Union. So we can disentangle to some extent, we can explore better the aggregate, the subnational aggregate, focusing on regional governments only, on municipal governments only, and also looking at both. So thanks to these databases, we can address the empirical challenge of measuring decentralization reform correctly, considering a multidimensional perspective, say each budgetary data, and also focusing on a sort of qualitative aspect of decentralization, that is the actual degree of taxing power and also the actual degree of autonomy in spending for this subnational government. So this is possible exploiting the richness of the databases, as Brendan presented before, because we have total revenue, disaggregated in tax and grants, and also the type of single tax, say income, property, consumption, and so on. The same works for the expenditure side. So we have an economic classification, but also a functional classification. So we can maybe analyze very deeply the budgetary finance of region and municipal levels. Next slide, please. What we can do, so we can provide new fiscal decentralization indicators based, of course, on the existing literature, methodology, and so on. We can calculate the two most famous, to some extent, decentralization indicators that are expenditure decentralization on one side and revenue decentralization on the other side. So we consider at the first time the REGOFI and MUNIFI databases together, and we observe the share of total expenditure combined REGOFI and MUNIFI over the general government total expenditure. The same works for the revenue side, and considering this basic formula that comes from the paper, the seminal contribution by Segaresco, Martinez Vázquez, and so on, we can have in the next slide some picture. Next slide, please, where we have these two indicators, say expenditure decentralization and revenue decentralization by single countries, considering the REGOFI and MUNIFI databases mixed, observed over a long time period to some extent, that is 2010, 2020. So on the left side, we have this graph by country for each year. On the right side, we consider average values over the whole period. And some insights emerge immediately in the sense that we can confirm the asymmetric nature of decentralization, in the sense that more expenditure rather than revenue. So this could open the room for further investigation on, for example, the vertical fiscal imbalance or the equalization mechanism, or how we can maybe provide resources to municipal and regional governments to guarantee the provision of such expenditure considering the revenue side. In the next slide, that is the last one, we replicate the calculation of this expenditure and revenue decentralization, focusing on only one of the two databases, that is the MUNIFI. And if we look as the same on the left side by country for each year, on the right side average values, we actually have also many countries at single level, so a detailed picture for each country. The sort of asymmetry is confirmed. So these preliminary, very preliminary, but very insightful indicators give rise to a sort of enthusiastic feeling to continue to play with this data, to provide new indicators on fiscal decentralization, on vertical imbalance, also to understand better the working rule to some extent on multi-level governance, and also to find, if it's possible, for example, an optimal degree of fiscal decentralization, as we can capture that one size does not fit all. And also in these terms, these two databases are useful not only for the academia or the researcher or the practitioner, but also for the policymaker, also for national organization, supranational organization. So I'm personally very excited in participating in this research group, and also to continue to work on these databases. And I appreciate the effort that two very important supranational organizations put together to provide this knowledge to all the community, that is academia, policymaker, institution, and so on. So in the next slide, thanks, I put some references for the floor, if it could be useful, the references that I quoted in the slide. So I thanks once more for your attention. I hope to take in time.
Thank you very much, Agnese, for a very interesting presentation and these first results of your analysis using these databases. We're really excited to learn more about these aspects once the whole study is ready, and really these kind of indicators that you showed are the basis for further analysis of impacts of decentralization from different aspects. We will next move on to the next presentation by Mr. Joachim Oliver Martins. Joachim is a special advisor of the EU Commissioner for Cohesion and Reforms and counselor at the Center of Prospective Studies and international information. He was previously Deputy Director of the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. He's also the author of several academic articles and the OECD publications on trade, competition, productivity, growth, environment, structural policy complementaries, and regional policies. Unfortunately, Joachim was not able to join online today, but he has sent a video which we will see next. Leslie, please feel free to start.
For the opportunity of participating in this workshop, and I apologize for not being able to be online today. The launching of this new OECD database on region and municipal finance is a real milestone in terms of the understanding of the role and functions of subnational governments. I think people often tend to forget that the key functions of governments, like public investment or provision of public services, are indeed a shared responsibility across levels of government. We have a lot of fiscal data for central governments and for the general government, so the sum of central and subnational governments, but we lacked dramatically of territorial disaggregation of these flows. Given the limited time, I would just like to flag some areas where I think this database will really make a difference. First, with this new data, I think we could make a very insightful comparison of fiscal equalization across countries. For example, I saw in the recent book on regional policy by Professor Ugo Fratesi a very nice chart comparing the levels of spending with the fiscal revenues by region. So there is a sort of 45-degree line where each region or municipality spends according to own revenues, and the line corresponding to the level of actual spending. So if you compare these two slopes, it will be rather easy, a sort of snapshot, to assess the level of fiscal equalization across countries and relate it to other economic parameters. Another very interesting use of this new data could be an assessment on the level of unfunded mandates across regions and municipalities. We all know that one of the sources of frustration with decentralization processes, apart from the question of capacity, subnational level, it's often that the devolution of responsibilities is not followed by an adequate transfer of resources. And so by combining this new fiscal data with other available information on the level and competencies developed at the subnational level, it would be in principle possible to make some assessment on whether or not the subnational government have access to sufficient resources to fulfill their mandates. Here again, the possibility to make international comparisons on a comparable basis, I think this is really what will bring new light to this field. An area where this new data will also be extremely useful is the identification of the links between public investment, which, by the way, I stress is mostly done on average for the OECD at the subnational level, and economic performance. Of course, we have still the problem of the investment done by central governments that reaches territories, and so we have difficulty to, in some sense, to map these investments done by the central governments, but I'm sure that I'm confident that the OECD team will continue to make progress. So these data on subnational public investment are absolutely critical to evaluate the capacity to adapt and implement the transition for a green economy. Again, most of the public investment involved in this transition is done by subnational governments. Of course, this also applies to a large extent to the adaptation to the digital transition. We know that despite the fact that innovation seems to be very concentrated in space, mostly in large agglomerated areas, the most important is the diffusion process and the capacity of subnational governments to be able to accompany and monitor, of course, this process. So I think I'll stop here. Once again, I'm extremely pleased to be here and the opportunity to participate in the launching of this new exciting project. So I look forward to all the insights that will emerge from the use of this new data set, and encore a big bravo to the OECD team for this work. It's great work. So thank you.
Okay, we are very thankful for Joachim for these very useful and interesting points raised. For instance, the unfunded mandates is a kind of a very common issue in many countries, but it has been quite difficult topic to analyze. We do hope that the new databases could help here to develop more nuanced analysis. Also, the public investment aspect, very good points raised by Joachim. We will now move on to our third presentation, which is given by Dr. Enid Slack. Enid is the director of the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. Enid has published several books and articles on property taxes, municipal fiscal health, intergovernmental transfers, municipal restructuring, and municipal infrastructure finance. Enid chairs the advisory board of Local Public Sector Alliance and is a member of the advisory board of the International Property Tax Institute. Enid, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Antti, and thank you for this invitation to present on leveraging new databases for research and policy making. I'd like to add my voice to those of others to say this expansion of public finance data on local governments and local and unemployment and regional governments is very important. I'm particularly interested in the information on individual cities. And the reason is I'm often asked questions about, well, how does this city compare to that city? Or does this city get more intergovernmental transfers than that city? And these are questions that are pretty hard to answer without comparable data across cities. And I want to give you two examples of projects that I have worked on in the last few years where I didn't have these data and really would have benefited from having these data. One was on local fiscal autonomy and one was on local fiscal health. So the project on local fiscal autonomy, several years ago, I was asked to compare the fiscal autonomy of 7 major international cities around the world, and in particular to look at whether cities with more fiscal autonomy have greater economic success. But there was no source of consistent data across cities, so I had to go to individual budgets of cities. And let me tell you, this is not an easy thing to do, to make these data comparable. First, there was a language issue. Not all these budgets were in English. I had to have them translated. The second problem was, what was the city? Is the city, the small cities at the metropolitan area? What are we defining as the city? Where do special purpose bodies fit in? So in some places you'd have a transit authority. It's not a government department of the city. Sometimes their revenue and expenditure data were included in the city budget. Sometimes they were not. How do you make those differences? How do you compare them when you have those differences? What expenditures are capital versus what expenditures are operating? Often you couldn't tell that from local budgets. Even what was included in each expenditure category, what somebody would call transportation might just be roads. For someone else, it might be roads and transit. It might be sidewalks. You couldn't tell what was happening because the terminology varies. And then one of the biggest issues we found, and I noticed there was a question in the Q&A here on what was a tax versus what was a grant. So a lot of cities would say, we levy income taxes. Well, in fact, they didn't. The central government levied income taxes and gave them a share of their revenues. That's what I would call tax sharing. To me, that's like a transfer, not a tax. And I know, as I say, someone's asked about this in the Q&A, and maybe we can get to that. So to be fair, this new database wouldn't solve all of my problems. I wouldn't be able to answer all of those questions, but it would have allowed me to determine on a consistent basis what expenditures cities are making, where they get their revenues, what types of taxes they levy, and how much of their revenues are own source revenues. And that's a pretty important question if we're looking at local fiscal autonomy. How much are they raising themselves versus how much they're getting in transfers. So again, I applaud you for putting together these data. And I heard Brendan explain how you match up data to make them consistent. You cannot overstate how complicated that is and how appreciative I am that you're doing that. A second area that I work a lot in is the area of fiscal health of municipalities. And I did one major project in Latin America, and I know that's a different part of the world, but this is something, I've done in other countries as well. But basically trying to figure out, what state are cities in? Are they in fiscal distress? Can they borrow more money? Can they do more things? What is the state of their fiscal health? And so this particular project was done for different countries, and different researchers provided data for different countries. I put together a template asking them to find certain kinds of data to do their analysis of fiscal health. So the authors put together information on city profile variables like population, income per capita, the unemployment rate, expenditures per capita, taxes per capita. And then we looked at 10 fiscal indicators. And I'm not going to go through them all, but they were things like own source revenues relative to total revenues, the size of the operating deficit, their debt to tax ratio, their debt charges relative to their own source revenues, their asset consumption ratio, and a number of different variables. Again, not all these variables are available in the data that you're talking about, but at least we could have measured some of them on a comparable basis for cities in different countries. So, I would say this is a great start to be able to compare the fiscal health, the fiscal autonomy, the level of decentralization for municipalities. Of course, there's always more to do. I would like to see more granular data, particularly more disaggregated expenditures in the COFOG. One of my frustrations with COFOG is that category called economic affairs, and transport is like one of those things. So for cities, transportation is a really big deal. And to have that lost in a category called economic affairs is a bit problematic. So I'd love to see more disaggregation of the COFOG. A better understanding of what are taxes versus tax sharing, which is a question I've already raised, and also more information on the state of infrastructure in municipalities. Because what we find when we analyze fiscal health is that by financial measures, municipalities are quite often very healthy. There's lots of legislation that makes them balance their budget and do all kinds of things. But the state of their infrastructure is where their health is really suffering. And if we could get more information on that, I think it would help us understand where municipalities are at. So again, thank you so much. I wish you'd done this before those projects that I was talking about, so I could have used these data, but I'm certain I'm going to be using the data going forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Enid, for these very important and extremely useful points and very kind comments. And we are very happy to hear your ideas also on the databases, and we'll certainly take these into account in the next steps. And indeed, own source revenues is really important aspect of municipal and regional self-governance, which is often difficult to analyze because of differing definition, and fiscal health of cities is a hugely important aspect as well. And we look forward to working with you and everyone on these issues in the future. We need to move on now. So we will next hear, thanks again, Enid, and we will next hear a comment speech by Mr. Thomas Woben. Thomas is currently the Director of Legislative Works at the European Committee of the Regions, working for the Coter, Econ and SEDEC commissions. He joined the committee in 2012 as Director for Horizontal Policies and Networks, and previously he had worked for Saxony-Anhalt, including as the Director of the Representation of the State to the European Union. Thomas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antti. I hope you can hear me well. I'm at a busy conference in Florence at the moment, and greetings to Canada. This work you've done is very much also in the interest of the committee. The committee is the representation of local regional government to the European Union, and we have worked with you already in the context of the UCLG for some time in the past. And what you've done here is just what the doctor ordered. We need this granular data simply because we need to know who is doing what and who is paying for what, and what is the state of fiscal health, as Annie just mentioned. And I'm surprised, or we are surprised, that we haven't had this data, even so we make lots of policies which account on it, including, for example, the question of co-financing of EU policies, and we need to know the ability of local regional authorities to be able to finance this. This is only one area where this data bank can be used for. It's also important that we ask ourselves, what do we learn out of the data? The second is, what do we use the knowledge for, and how it does implement into policies? And I think that's the crucial things. And coming from the policy side of the debate, of course, we see this very important data also important for monitoring different policies, particularly also the link between the fiscal and for example, the tax sharing, as just mentioned, and the economic performance of regions. What can we trace back? The other thing is also, for example, the ability to let's say be able to invest in new strategic areas. Also, the future of digitalization and the investment possibilities of local regional authorities in digitalization would be a certain area where we see that such a data bank can play a key role. It's also important, this comparability of data, and the taxonomy allows also regions and cities to ask themselves, why are others doing better, and what could be the reasons for it? So this interregional learning and peer learning is also a crucial element in this context. The key element for the committee is also that this is used for the debate on the future of cohesion policy and the future do no harm to cohesion, that we also look at fiscal decentralization as a key element of effective decentralization. We often discuss about lack of capacity at the local and regional level to implement policies. Very often it is ineffective decentralization, and very often it's unfunded mandates, as it's also been raised by Joachim. And we need to find policy conclusions to it. It's not only a research question, it's also a question how future policies will address this. And one concrete example is, for example, in the European Union, we have the so-called European semester, in which we look at different policy areas. And so far, it is been done at the national level. But national level hides the divergence in the member states. And with this data, we can much better assess how is the situation on the ground in order also design better policies for the future to help the green and digital transition, to address the demographic change, to address also democratic questions of active participation of citizens. So this data bank, we applaud very much. We will use it actively, and we are very happy that it has been done. It should have done much earlier. And it is, of course, also important to connect it to the question of division of powers, who is in charge of what, and what can we learn out of the data. So we will actively use it. Congratulations to all involved, and we are happy to contribute to this discussion in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your comments, and these are really highly useful. We're very happy to hear that you think this work is useful for the work of regions and municipalities. I don't see, I think we are a bit late of our schedule. We don't see specific questions for this session, but I would like to take this opportunity to answer a few questions raised by the speakers. Maybe from our team's perspective, the next steps, and like Enid mentioned, the COFOG aspect, and and others. I think these are something that we will indeed think about in the future, and how to ensure the continuation of this work and expansion, hopefully to areas where it's the most relevant. This is something that we are thinking about, certainly. There was also the presentation by Agnese earlier. She has been able to use this database already a little bit, and showing that what can be done with it. And we are really hopeful that other researchers will also find this database, because it's now we're being so hands-on in developing this database. And I think in the next steps, we need to focus also on the dissemination, and ensuring that as many researchers and policymakers as possible will know about it, and we will hopefully be able to organize some later events where we can focus on some specific aspects of the database and see how we can maybe improve it further. But I think I need to stop here, because we are running a bit late of the time, and the next session is waiting. So thank you again for all speakers. Thank you very much for your time. And I will now pass the floor to Charlotte.